Welcome to Neuroqueering Somatics, a conversation at the intersection of neurodivergence and somatic practice. My name is Elizabeth Osgood Campbell, and I have the great pleasure and privilege of serving as the executive director of ISMETA, the International Somatic Movement, Education, and Therapy Association. On behalf of our board of directors, our operations team, and particularly our Equity, Justice, and Accessibility Committee, we welcome you to this event. It is my great pleasure to introduce Adina Doctor, a master somatic movement educator and therapist with ISMETA. Adina is a neurodivergent movement educator and founding member of Divergent Design Studios. Adina proposed this idea for today's event during a community conversation, which our Equity, Justice, and Accessibility Committee hosts on a bi-monthly basis. This idea emerged last fall, and Adina, I thank you for your perseverance in bringing this important vision into form. So together with Adina and the Equity, Justice, and Accessibility Committee, we co-host this vitally important conversation today. Adina, welcome.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And thanks so much to you and ISMETA for making this event possible. Welcome. It's amazing to see so many people here. We are thrilled to bring you this conversation with Dr. Nick Walker and Katy Higgins Lee. Many of us are here because we owe a huge debt of gratitude to Dr. Walker. His pioneering work on the neurodiversity paradigm liberated us from a pathology-based paradigm that labeled us as broken, wrong, not normal, and in need of fixing. His work opened the door to a radically different understanding that neurodivergence is a vital expression of human diversity. Dr. Walker has been a leading thinker on neurodiversity for more than 20 years and is best known for his foundational work on neuroqueer theory and his influential essay collection, Neuroqueer Heresies. For many of us, we are here and thriving because of Dr. Walker's work. For those who are new to Dr. Walker's work, let me offer an analogy. The great musician, Patti Smith, is often referred to as the godmother of punk rock because of the way her music subverted the norms of rock music. In the same way, Dr. Walker is a godparent of the neurodiversity paradigm. He is a delightfully subversive thinker who has invited us to celebrate ourselves and neuroqueer our world in ways that weren't previously available. Both somatics and the neurodiversity paradigm illuminate and explore sensory perception, human embodiment, and consciousness. They braid together in a kind of DNA spiral, giving us clues about human diversity and even the nature of consciousness itself. So we invite you into a conversation about post-normal possibilities. For the many people here with questions, seeking answers about how somatic practice and neurodivergence intersect and influence each other beyond the cage of ableism and the sting of being normed, let's open up a world where we can explore post-normal possibilities. And I can't think of anyone better to host this conversation than my friend and colleague, Katy Higgins Lee. Katy is an important voice in the neurodiversity movement. Her work is thoughtful and inclusive, and she never shies away from fierce advocacy for marginalized communities. Thank you so much, Katy. And I'll turn it over to you and Dr. Walker now.
Thank you so much, Adina, and thank you to Ismeta also. And again, I really want to thank Adina for thinking of this idea, because none of us would be here right now for this event if Adina hadn't come up with this idea and proposed it to Ismeta. I have some things I was going to say, but I just want to check in with you, Nick. Is there anything you want to say before I kind of dive into some things?
No, you go ahead. Honestly,
Okay.
I don't know how I'm going to live up to that introduction.
Yeah, I can understand that. Yeah. So I wanted to share, before getting into some questions, I wanted to share a little bit of history that Nick, I don't know if you even realize this, but you and I both attended California Institute of Integral Studies, so CIS, in the Somatics Counseling Master's Program around the same time, I believe. I think I might have been maybe one cohort or two cohorts right before you. So I think I was finishing up right when you started, I believe, if I have done my investigating correctly. But we never met back then. I knew nothing about the neurodiversity paradigm or any of that back then. I started that program 20 years ago this year. And then I learned about your work around the time that you published Neuroqueer Heresies. And that was around the time that I was figuring out my own neurodivergence. And I was so impacted by your writing. Like it helped me clarify so many things about myself. And so then I sought out other writings by you after reading that book. I read your dissertation, and then I found your chapter in the anthology Diverse Bodies, Diverse Practices, which was, of course, edited by our mutual former professor, Don Hanlon Johnson. And those works were so influential for me. And then around a year or two ago, I actually started kind of working with you, collaborating on a couple of projects, which we won't go into what those are now, but we only collaborated ever through email. So I find it very amusing that the first time that we are actually having a live conversation face-to-face is in front of potentially like 100 to 200 people. I find that very amusing. So I just wanted to say that. And then the other thing I wanted to say before I dive into questions is just something I always say whenever I begin any event where there's a lot of people and there's, the need to pay attention and focus, etc. I always like to just ask people to remember to tend to your nervous system while we're together, whatever way that works for you. Tend to your nervous system, tend to your needs, tend to your body, mind. As you can see, I tend to move my chair side to side. I have a rock that I'll be kind of stimming with.
You're a side-to-side rocker, and I'm a back and forward rocker. So
yes.
Got an exciting rhythm going.
Right. Yeah, so I just wanted to say that. Okay, so for getting into the questions, to begin, because the people attending today are likely to have a huge variety of backgrounds. There's probably some people that are really more in the neurodiversity movement, and then some people that are more in the somatics world, and then some people that are kind of in both. I wanted to take a little time to just define some terms and concepts so that we have some foundation to build the conversation on. So to begin with then, I wanted to ask you if you'd be willing to give an overview of what do we mean when we say the words neurodiversity and then neurodivergence, and how are they different?
Yes. Okay. So neurodiversity is the diversity among human body minds. Just, the fact that different people's minds and nervous systems work differently, and the way we function cognitively and perceptually, and the way we embody that is widely different among humans. And so that's neurodiversity, and all human beings, and in fact, all beings that have central nervous systems are part of the spectrum of neurodiversity. And then, as is often the case when there's diversity of any sort among humans, people tend to construct particular norms and social hierarchies. Unfortunately, people tend to say, you know, whatever it is, this culture or this way of doing gender or this ethnic group is normal, and everyone else is some sort of bizarre outlier who clearly needs to be, you know, dominated or colonized or brought into alignment with our norms. And that's the case with neurodiversity too. So there's a particular uh, sort of range of cognitive and perceptual functioning, particular range of uh, ways of doing consciousness and cognition and embodiment that are considered normal. And these norms, you know, there's no such thing as a normal brain or a normal body mind, but there's a particular range that gets considered normal and a particular way of performing cognition and consciousness uh, and embodying it in the world that gets considered normal, and ways of perceiving reality that get considered normal. These change in different cultures. The norms are different from culture to culture and vary over history, but every society in every period in history tends to think of their norms as natural. And of course, we see this apply with things like, you know, gender norms as well. So if one falls significantly outside of society's constructed normal range, then one is neurodivergent. And this concept of neurodivergence is, I think, crucial for our conversation today. Um, it's a much bigger field and concept, and much more broad and inclusive than most people realize, because what happened was the concept of neurodiversity developed among autistic rights activists in the 1990s. And so this whole idea of neurodivergence, you know, was initially a lot of it was focused on, you know, in the neurodiversity movement, the idea of you know, inclusion and an end to stigma and greater inclusion for people whose minds differed from the dominant social norms. You know, that tended to be focused at first on autistic people, and then, you know, people with other commonly pathologized innate forms of neurodivergence, dyslexia, or what is often called ADHD. I prefer the less pathologizing term kinetic cognitive style for that. Um, and so there are various specific forms of innate neurodivergence, you know, people who didn't feel they should be pathologized, and, you know, or overly medicalized, or stigmatized. And so that's what people still often associate with when they hear the word neurodivergence. Now, Cassiana Asasumas, who the autistic rights activist who coined the term neurodivergence when she was in her teens, in fact, back in 1999, um, she actually intended the word to be much more inclusive than that. And I've been very dedicated, out of uh, partly out of just my personal regard and respect for Cassiana, who I've, you know, known for many years, and also because of uh, just sort of how broad I think the scope of neurodiversity work and scholarship and such should be. I've been very committed to maintaining that broadly inclusive definition, and that's kind of what's led me to a lot of the work I'm doing these days and this concept of neuroqueering and such. So Cassiana's idea originally was, as I said earlier, any significant divergence, with a big capital boldface, any significant divergence from the dominant norms of perceptual and cognitive performance. Um, and so that includes innate things, innate ways of being like autism, dyslexia, Down syndrome, um, all of those things. It includes many other things that are pathologized in different ways. And things that are, called, often labeled as, mental illnesses, psychoses and such. And it includes things that are acquired. So PTSD, right? Neurodivergence, acquired dramatic alteration of neurocognitive functioning, dementia, and uh, all sorts of exciting stuff like that. So things that are acquired uh, through illness or accident, things that are innate, things that maybe should not be treated as pathologies, right? This sort of started with the autism rights movement and the idea that it's autism is something that's better accommodated rather than treated as a pathology to be cured. But also things that are pathologies that we might want to treat. I mean, obviously, we want treatments for PTSD. We don't want to say, oh, it's not a pathology. You should just be proud of your PTSD and keep it forever. We want to, it shouldn't be stigmatized, but there's good reason to want to treat it. And this is where I'm particularly interested these days, and where we very uh, uh, excitingly intersect with the field of somatics. There's also intentionally acquired neurodivergence. So if your consciousness and way of doing cognition and embodying yourself is altered to the point where it diverges dramatically from dominant norms through, say, meditation or psychedelics use or somatic practices, that is also neurodivergence. So, uh, very broad field in terms of what it refers to. And so I'm interested in my work these days in, well, uh, destigmatizing innate neurodivergence and looking at, for innately neurodivergent, neurocognitive minority groups like autistic people, for instance, looking at how we can foster well-being, and but also interested in the intentional development of specific forms of neurodivergence. So interested in how can we alter our perception and cognition through carefully curated and chosen practices. So that's to me that that obviously a lot of this in terms of practices falls in the realm of somatics, and to me at the same time, all of it falls within the realm of exploring neurodiversity in a sense. Uh, uh, we've sort of the neurodiversity movement as like a social justice movement has tended to be focused on destigmatizing neurodivergence and on celebrating human neurodiversity, um, uh, with this concept of neuroqueering, of intentionally altering consciousness and cognition and how we embody it, including through somatic work. I'm really in the business not just of celebrating human neurodiversity, but increasing it.
Right. thank you for all that. And that brings me to what my next question was, is if you could explain what neuroqueering is for anyone here who isn't familiar with the term and the concept.
Right. So, um, so we're very used to thinking of queer as an identity label, and in fact, uh, back when I was a kid, queer was a slur, and there was a reclaiming of it. Which I remember vividly, which I was peripherally involved in as a teenage queer activist in the 1980s in the Reagan era. There was this very intentional reclaiming by young queer people who wanted uh, sort of an inclusive umbrella for people who, or it wasn't just about, gay or lesbian, but this broad spectrum of divergence from gender and sexual norms, and this idea of building solidarity by having a unified term. And I remember, being a teenage queer activist and like going to, you know, marches and rallies in New York and Philadelphia, and handing out those little flyers like urging people to reclaim the word queer and claim queer identity. And some people embracing it enthusiastically, and some older gay people being very angry because they didn't think it was reclaimable as a slur and just sort of wanted the word to be buried ideally. And so obviously it has been widely embraced now. But in queer theory, in a lot of branches of the sort of the more academic field of queer theory, um, queer is largely a verb, and it started out that way even before it was a slur. This idea, that it used to it meant used to mean like to tangle something, or to mess with it. So like if fishermen would find a fishing line caught on something and be like, ah, my line's been queered. And so in a sense, literally, to queer something means to make it not straight. And so so this idea of queering as a verb, you see in the work of queer theorists like Judith Butler, for instance, this idea that heteronormativity, this performance of binary heterosexual gender roles in this particular narrow way that people are trained and pressured to conform to, that they call this heteronormativity. And so the idea is, when you're queering, what you're queering by being queer is you're queering heteronormativity. You're essentially to queer heteronormativity means to subvert it, to tamper with it, to mess with it creatively, to liberate oneself with it, to help to loosen its grip on yourself and everyone else. And so neuroqueer theory really is about extending this uh, this branch of queer theory thought into the realm of neurodiversity, and saying, well, uh, neuronormativity works a lot like heteronormativity, and in fact is entwined with heteronormativity. And and so neuronormativity can also be queered, right? We can also act in ways that subvert neuronormativity and encourage us to transcend the limits of neuronormativity. So that is neuroqueering.
Great, thank you. And of course, when we queer or neuroqueer, we are neuroqueering our body mind. And so what I'd like to do, you already mentioned somatics, of course, but I wanted to now ask you to, because there are varying ways that people define somatics, I wanted to ask you if you would give kind of your own definition, how you conceptualize the field of somatics. And I just wanted to mention too that one of the things that I've appreciated, you mentioned in terms of defining neurodivergence, that you tend to advocate for the broadly inclusive definition. And I
Yes.
appreciate that my understanding of your definition of somatics is also broadly inclusive. And so that's
Yes.
specifically why I wanted to ask you about this, to define it for this group.
Yes, exactly. So I am in fact broadly conclusive about that definition as well. And so and you'll notice that the neuroqueering is also very broadly is also a very broad term, because anything that you do to liberate yourself from perceptual and cognitive norms and the performance of normal is neuroqueering in a sense. So but yeah, so with somatic practices, I define as any practices that create intentional positive transformation through working with embodiment. So it's a very broad definition, again, and so that because I think it should be a really broad field. I think it's it's if we narrow the definition, we always run the risk of cutting out something valuable. So yeah, simple and broad and inclusive, to allow for the possibility not only of covering all of the many different forms of somatic embodiment work that already exist in cultures around the world and throughout history, but also to allow for the development of new practices that haven't occurred to us. And to not have anybody say, oh, that doesn't count as a somatic practice because it doesn't meet this 20-point definition.
Right, exactly. Yeah, thank you for that. So I'm just deciding where to go next. I wanted to mention, I mentioned before the chapter that you wrote in the Diverse Bodies, Diverse Practices anthology, which is titled Somatics and Autistic Embodiment. And that chapter is really beautiful. And I just wanted to say that I recommend everyone read that if you're interested in somatics and neurodivergence or neuroqueering. But I wanted to just mention the section in that chapter where you share about your participation in somatic practices, and specifically you discuss Aikido, and then you discuss paratheatrical research, and how within the context of that practice, you began to notice yourself moving in ways that you hadn't, it sounded like maybe since childhood, which you later realized was stimming, but you didn't even know the word yet from what you said in the chapter. And your descriptions of that are just, they're so lovely. But you refer to the process of, quote, rediscovering the dance of my autistic self. And this would likely fit into what many people refer to as like an unmasking process, but I don't think you actually use that word in the chapter. And the chapter and these descriptions really illustrate how somatic practices can be liberatory for those of us who are autistic. But then at the end of the chapter, you also discuss how these practices can also be liberatory for those who are not autistic. And I don't think you use the word neuroqueering there, but it seems like that's a little bit of what you're describing.
Oh yeah, totally. And I was actively holding myself back from calling it neuroqueering because I had a page limit. I had a word count that I couldn't exceed, and I knew if I opened that neuroqueering can of worms, I'd have to explain a whole lot about what I meant by it and such. And so I was like, okay, this isn't the place. So I held myself back from using the term. But yes, I'm definitely talking about neuroqueering there.
Great. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. With that then, and I'm assuming this is true, but would you say that paratheatrical research and Aikido have been part of your neuroqueering process then also? And also wondering if there have been any other somatic practices that have been really integral parts of your own neuroqueering process.
Oh, lovely. Yes, yes to the first part of my own neuroquerying process for sure. I think I view good Aikido practice as intrinsically neuroqueering, which I can say more about in a bit if you like, because I'm always happy to talk about Aikido. And paratheater was definitely is definitely intensely neuroqueering as a practice. Um, wildly consciousness altering, way outside of conventional norms of even, uh just what it means to be human, I think. So so yes to those. Other practices, um those have been the two biggest, most important ones in my life. I have a longstanding mindfulness meditation practice that I uh, sort of return to periodically. Over the past many decades, that I come back to periodically. Sometimes it's right, sometimes it's not. Uh, I um, This will possibly shatter my image as some sort of radical or something like that, but I have a morning prayer practice that I'm very serious about. That to me is a somatic practice. Um, and walking, honestly. Um, Walking is huge, I mean, and I'm if you can, if you are, not you know, not suffering from, any uh mobility impairment that keeps you from walking. I encourage everyone to walk a lot. It's such a deep part of human evolution, and it has so much to teach. It's sort of like, in terms of like how we tap into our deepest primal ancestral human roots. Walking is actually, I think, an amazing practice, approached mindfully, and if you are mobility impaired in some way, uh, wheel around, get out there in a chair and move around, because just that practice of moving through space mindfully is I think does something vital for consciousness.
Yes, thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And then before I go to my next question, I just want to add to that something that I have found is sort of a practice of almost like neuroqueering my walking, especially when I can be in a place of solitude, like in nature somewhere, and to walk in ways that are non-normative, just to sort of experiment with walking.
Hmm.
Sometimes that will turn into what is almost like a dance, and sometimes not. Sometimes there'll be sounds that I'll make as well. So just wanted to add that I totally with you on walking, that there's a lot there. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to ask about was, you've shared that you developed the term neuroqueering within the context of a psychodynamics class, I believe,
Hmm.
in
Yes.
the somatics program with
Yes.
with with, with Ian. Is that right?
Yeah, that's
So
right.
with Ian Grand,
Dear Ian Grant.
yeah,
Yes.
our late professor at CIS. So I'm curious if you would be interested in sharing a little bit about your process in developing the concept within the context of that class, and wondering if there's anything about that particular class or Ian that kind of created the conditions for this to emerge.
Yes. I want to say, by the way, in terms of my development of neuroqueer theory and the concept, that I'm not the only person to develop it. I absolutely want to make sure I'm not known as like the person who created there. There's this big issue in the field of neurodiversity studies because this one particular sociologist who was an early user of the term neurodiversity in academic writing, later tried to claim credit for inventing the whole concept, and uh, and then started using her platform to spread transphobia, and so eventually got outed. People sort of went and uncovered the actual origins of the term and made them public and such. But I have this real that's really fueled my distaste for people trying to build names for themselves as I am the person who came up with this. I'm definitely not. A lot of people put in you know put in work and thought and ideas around the concept of neuroqueer theory. Remy Yurgo, really notably, wrote this wonderful book, Authoring Autism, that uses neuroqueer theory as a critical lens at a way more sophisticated level of academic writing than I'm capable of. I actually just found out after Neuroqueer Heresies was published that an autistic person named Andrea Wilson started using the term neuroqueer back in 2003, so before I did. And I didn't even know about it at the time. So next time I publish something on neuroqueer theory, I'm going to have to be like, oh, also this other person in 2003 was actually probably the first one I know about. So, I think when an idea's time has come, is going to start surfacing in multiple different ways, multiple different places, kind of like, Isaac Newton and Leibniz coming up with calculus at the same time in different countries and then spending the rest of their lives feuding over who developed it first. So I think, so I'm, I, so yeah, so it's important to say that I first came up with it independently, but I'm not the only one, and that what we think of as neuroqueer theory is definitely a collective product. Um, but uh but yeah, that came to me, as you say, in Dr. Ian Grand's psychodynamics class, and at CIS, second semester CIS Master's in Somatic Psychotherapy program. And yeah, Ayn Rand was an extraordinary somatic practitioner and wrote about somatics better than anyone else I've ever encountered. Um, and tragically passed away in 2017 while he was my dissertation chair, by the way. Um, but passed away in 2017 without ever completing an entire book of his own. And I was, in fact, right up to the end, um, uh, working with him to try to create a book of his work, but he didn't make it far enough for us to manage to pull that together. Uh, his work is extraordinary and can sort of, be tracked down in various journal articles and such. And um, yeah, he has a particular piece that he wrote in 1978 called The Marvelous in the Real, which was life-changing for me. It is the single best piece of writing about somatics that I've ever seen, and is very hard to find. Published in 1978 in the Journal of Biological Psychology, which only existed for a few years and was out of stopped existing before anyone started digitizing journals. So I have it in the form of like uh, a a PDF of a really bad photocopy of journal pages. But I gotta I I'm fairly sure it's public domain now, and at some point I'm just gonna find a way to publish it somewhere because it's more people need to read it. Anyway, this beautiful article, this beautiful little piece that he wrote, talked about the purpose of somatic work, as, or the function of somatic work as breaking down these fixed patterns in the body, these fixed patterns of tension and restriction that we acquire over the course of our development, and liberating this sort of deep organismic spontaneity, this capacity to tune into our deep somatic impulses, to continually change and reshape ourselves. And uh he taught in class, he would demonstrate his working methods of, like, very Wilhelm Reich inspired, and very, like, how do you tap into these patterns of movement. It was very in line with what I was learning in the paratheater work as well, which I was already well into at the time that I was in the somatics program. So Ian, yeah, he was very into this idea of somatic practice as liberation from these the limitations of the patterns that we had learned to embody habitually, and how do you tune back into the spontaneous impulse. And uh, so that was, yeah, that's been central to my work ever since, and was central to the idea of neuroqueer theory. So I was writing this paper, and it was this reflection paper where there was no really strict assignment, except I was very open-ended with that stuff. It was like, how is this stuff landing with you? What are you what are you learning from it? And it's that was so I was thinking, because I was at that time uh uh you know about 3 years out of the closet as autistic, um and um and I was learning to reclaim my stimming, and starting to see how much I'd suppressed it. And um I was thinking about uh well, that was exactly what Ian was describing, that I had developed these habits of what these days is often called masking, and I'll talk more about that in a bit, if we get there. But this habit of suppressing my natural autistic embodiment and movement impulses, and the act of refinding them in my body was exactly the process that Ian was teaching about and writing about. And um, somewhere I made the connection. I was also sort of exploring this, like, whole uh, g- gender uh, gender normativity issue, and realizing, you know, kind of recognizing that I had suppressed my natural gender queerness and gender fluidity, and for the sake of survival, growing up in some very very tough areas, uh, built uh, this facade of classic macho masculinity that felt like a trap. And so I was starting to experiment with breaking that down as well. And I realized that it was the same process. And so that led me to this idea of, like, wow, okay, these are entwined. I can't even tell where my internalized habits of gender normativity and my internalized habits of neuronormativity um, uh, uh, are separate from each other. They blur together. And so that led me, in writing about it, to say, well, I'm queering my gender, and and I'm neuroqueering. And so yeah, so that's where it all started for me. 2008, I in grand psychodynamics class. And now I occasionally teach the psychodynamics class in the somatic psychology program, which is a delight. And try to sort of spread, pass on the legacy, pay it forward, that sort of thing. Talk about the things I learned from Ian. So
Mhm.
he's sort of an unsung godparent of neuroqueer theory.
Oh, that's great. I really like that. That's a great way to think of him. I think he would appreciate that too. um, uh, I'm wondering, with neuroqueering, because we are all body minds,
Mhm.
I'm wondering do you think that neuroqueering is inherently a somatic practice? And is it ever not somatic to neuroqueer?
I think neuroqueering on an individual level is always somatic. I think because we are all body minds, because consciousness is embodied. Um, uh, there's also cultural neuroqueering, which is not necessarily somatic, even though it ties in with individual neuroqueering. But I think there's you can neuroqueer literature by subverting neuronormative expectations in literature, for instance. I uh, we have like I'm part of a worker-owned publishing collective called Autonomous Press, and we do uh, an an annual multi-genre lit anthology called the Spoon Knife Anthology, and one of the goals of that is to be a neuroqueer lit anthology where we're looking at stories that subvert normative expectations in some way. And so I think there's just like there's queer literature that subverts heteronormative expectations. So I think that uh so I think that you can have a literature um that's neuroqueer, and you can create neuroqueer spaces. I think Helen Egger is in our audience today, who's done some wonderful work around neuroqueer learning spaces. And within, neuroqueer literature, or having a neuroqueer learning space or practice space, that's where neuronormative expectations go out the window. That can allow for individual neuroqueering on a somatic level, but I do think that it's possible to do cultural neuroqueering or neuroqueering of space that's not, strictly speaking, somatic, except insofar as it ties in with individual neuroqueering.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. So something that I wanted to make sure we talk about is that some somatic lineages have roots that are kind of entangled with like ableism and ideas of like bodily quote like correction, and therefore kind of pushing for normative expectations, unfortunately. And so this idea of kind of like noticing what's being normed in our somatic spaces. And so I'm wondering if there's anything you wanted to say about kind of any ways potentially that the field of somatics has not at times been in alignment with neuroqueer intentions in either like specific practices or within the greater field of somatics.
I think the field as a whole, I think, is just wonderful. I'll say that. I think that I don't think there's such a thing as bad somatic practices, because any practice can be useful in some way. Rolfing, let's talk about rolfing. Rolfing, um, is very big on norms. They really have this, idea of like there's one right way for the spine to be aligned and for the body to be aligned. And so there is that very strongly dogmatic uh thread within Rolfing. And yet I found Rolfing extremely valuable, and uh learning to learning to align my body in that way, to try it on and then take from what I needed from it was great, and I've had that same experience, um I mean, some Alexander technique teachers may, for instance, have very specific ways that they want everyone to do a particular thing, to try a particular motion. But it's not like they're a bunch of fascists going around and policing everybody's movement. It's just you go to this particular practitioner, and they'll teach you their particular way of doing it. But then you're free to integrate that into your life however you want or not. So I think that even when a particular somatic practice has established norms about how to do things, I don't find it oppressive. I think these are all tools that we can benefit from, and it's valuable to learn, oh, this particular school of thought has this particular way to do it. If someone comes to my Aikido classes, they're going to learn like you do your posture this way, do a stance this way, we sit like this, we bow like this. And I'm not following them home and saying, oh, you have to do it this way at home, but they get something out of doing it while they're in the dojo practicing, and then they decide how they integrate that into their life. So I think that's you know um when when we get into the habit of spotting and calling out oppressive norms, it's easy to overdo it and think that like any norm is oppressive, or anyone telling you this is the right way to do it is oppressive. But it's not really. If you're going voluntarily to learn a particular discipline and a particular system, you know, and it's not being forced on you, you decide you want to be there and learn it and practice it, I don't think that's oppressive at all. And every form of work does have its norms. I think that the problems have largely been problems of framing, where there has been an issue of something oppressive, or unhealthy norm enforcement. It's been problems of framing. So uh I mean, I have a lot of issues with polyvagal theory because I don't think it's scientifically valid. I don't think their premises hold up scientifically, but also the fact that uh um their framing of autism and ADHD is very pathologizing and like, oh, we can fix this. So I think that's, the practices may be good, but uh but the framing is really messed up and sort of like throwback to the 1950s or something. And so that becomes a problem for me. Like that's stuff I won't recommend because of that. um or uh and some of it is just, some of it, there's less excuse for that because we have the neurodiversity paradigm. We have, the non-oppressive ways of talking about it. And they could have just, talk to an autistic person, talk to an autistic scholar and be like, hey, how do we frame this in a way that's not messed up and is not stigmatizing anyone? Or but like a more benign example, Janet Adler's authentic movement work with autistic children was wonderful, was great for the children who got to do this free movement stuff that they were hungering for. The framing, when you hear her talk about it in old films and writings and stuff, is super pathologizing because that was the only available framing back then. And so we kind of like I cringe now to look at how she talks about it, but I realize like, okay, that was the best framing that was available to her at the time, and the work she was doing with them was actually really liberating and benign.
Yes, thank you for saying that. I definitely agree. I went back and watched maybe 6 months ago. I'm not remembering the name of her film right now, but the film where she's working with autistic children. And
Mhm.
I had a very similar response, but didn't have the ability to kind of like get it in such a tidy way of describing it. So thank you for saying that. It helps me clarify some things about what I saw in that. Um, uh, and that also reminds me of kind of when you're talking about the framing, that a lot of it I think probably depends on the practitioner and
Mhm.
their own relationship with normativity.
Oh yeah.
And so when I teach therapists about kind of practicing through the lens of the neurodiversity paradigm, I often say that you don't need to be or identify as neurodivergent to work with neurodivergent clients, but
Mhm.
that it is very helpful to neuroqueer your therapy practice or neuroqueer yourself as a practitioner. Um,
Mhm.
and I was just curious to hear if you have any ideas of ways to do that for people who are healing practitioners of some kind, specifically somatics. What do you think it means to kind of neuroqueer their somatic practice or neuroqueer themselves as a somatic practitioner?
Breaking down their own norms in their own practice. I mean, you want to go to a somatic practitioner who does their own somatic work as well, of course, just like you want if you're in psychoanalysis, you want to go to a psychoanalyst who's also been analyzed themselves, or that sort of thing. You want someone, you know, you want someone who has e- experienced, even if they're not experiencing it, like even if you're autistic, say they're not experiencing it as an autistic person, you want someone who's done the work and is doing the work. That's important. I don't think anybody would come to my Aikido dojo if I'm like, oh, I don't do Aikido myself. I just sit on the sidelines and tell you what to do. It's so I think that's um so yeah, I think that's important. Uh and I think that a somatic practitioner, so especially a somatic psychotherapist, but any sort of somatic practitioner who wants to, neuroqueer their practice, they do it by neuroqueering themselves. Use your own somatic work to break down internalized norms. And when we're talking about neuroqueering a practice, neuroqueering a therapy practice, or neuroqueering a somatic workspace or something like that, really what we're talking about doing first and foremost is creating a space where it's okay to be outside of the norms. And so the, the what that is about, being able to being able to hold a space where you're not enforcing norms, where you're not like uh panicking because somebody's not being normal, being able to hold a space where you're letting people explore and neuroqueer and explore their potentials outside of imposed norms. Really, that is about tolerance for uncertainty and ambiguity, being able to sit with, I don't know what this person's doing. I don't know what's emerging here. It's not, it's not what I was taught was normal, but something is happening. And as long as no one's getting hurt, I'm going to be here for the process and hold the space for the process and be open to seeing where it goes and then help the client integrate it as needed. Um, and so uh, that is about tolerance for uncertainty and ambiguity. And I think that so much, I would even say most of the oppression and uh, um, intolerance that happens not just from like, you know, authoritarian governments and such, but even, you know, from people across the political spectrum. Um, so much of the intolerance that we see is rooted in intolerance for ambiguity, that people leap into polarization. You know, if you're not with us, you're against us. You know, if I'm not sure what's going on, you must be the enemy, you know, in some way. So uh, I think it's an imperative, a piece of neuroqueering work, and an imperative in terms of goals of somatic work overall, maybe in terms of goals of the field, to help people increase their tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty, to help people stay present with ambiguity and uncertainty. And that to me is the root of neuroqueering a practice, that if you can be present with the uncertainty of, I don't know what the heck my client is expressing in their body right now. I don't know what the heck is emerging, and I'm okay for that. I'm going to be here for it. You have essentially created a beautiful neuroqueer practice just by making that internal change in yourself.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. So I wanted to ask maybe one more question before we
Sure.
transition to Q&A. And this one is sort of more, I just wanted to give you the opportunity, if you are interested, because I'm sure we would all love to hear, if there's anything you want to say about both transformative, I believe your PhD is it transformative studies? Is that the correct?
Yes.
And then, so there's that. So if there's anything you want to say about kind of transformative studies and somatics and neuroqueering, and also psychedelics, because I know that you recently helped to create the new CIIS Bachelor of Science program in psychedelic studies. And I can see all kinds of connections between all of these things. So I just wanted to see if there's anything that you feel inspired to share before we transition to the Q&A.
Yeah. And I also, I guess I promised to say something about masking too, or unmasking. So
Yes.
I
Yeah.
should say
Thank you.
that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, let's see, transformative studies. The transformative studies doctoral program at CIS is great, highly recommended. Is about transformative learning processes. You know, what um, whether it's individual or cultural or societal or within a particular field. It's this idea of uh, learning, you know, regular learning, one is adding to one's knowledge base. Transformative learning, there's an actual perspective shift, a broadening of one's ability to take different perspectives. And so obviously, you know, with my interest in seeing beyond prevailing social paradigms, you know, you can see where that appeals to me. So I just found it, you know, I found it a very ideal program for supporting the kind of work I wanted to do, because they'll support you in pursuing a line of inquiry across disciplinary boundaries and such, wherever it takes you. So that's a great program. Um, let's see, what was the other piece? Oh, psychedelics, right. Yeah, psychedelics are a great tool for neuroqueering, obviously a great tool for uh seeing outside uh you know, conventional norms of cognition and such. Proper integration of psychedelic work is crucial, because we do see, you know, I mean, there's a lot of like, you know, right-wing tech bros, you know, Elon Musk and, you know, his various clones and such, who are very into like microdosing psychedelics, and it doesn't seem to really you know, um doesn't seem to make them, you know, more tolerant or appreciative of beauty in the world or anything like that, because I don't think they're integrating the lessons of getting an outside perspective, and those lessons have to be integrated in some way. How are you okay, well, I've got this, I had this amazing insight on psychedelics. How am I actually going to integrate it into how I live and how I treat other people, you know? Um, we could have an experience of the essential oneness of all things, and it can turn you more towards loving kindness towards all people, which is something I've certainly tried to do in my life, though not with nearly as much success as I'd like to, you know, as I would hope. But I'm still working at it. But it can also just be, you know, grounds for a deepening narcissism too. To oh, I'm amazing because I had this experience, you know, and to handle it that way. And so proper integration is crucial, and I think that's where the field of somatics really comes in. That how having had this amazing experience, whether you had it with meditation or psychedelics or what, you know, whatever, when you have some kind of transcendent experience, how do you actually learn to embody it in your life? Because if you can't bring it into your embodiment, it's ultimately just lost or becomes, you know, a fuel for narcissistic fantasy. So, um, so yeah, that's what I'll say about psychedelics. I'll say they were a great part of my own path at various times, and um, they certainly can be a tool of neuroqueering if you use them that way. If you use them to break down normative cognitive patterns and to open your tolerance for ambiguity and for a wider, you know, range of cognition and perception in yourself and in other people. Um, yeah, and then I'll say about unmasking. So unmasking, for those unfamiliar, is just this thing with autistic and some other neurodivergent people now, of not hiding it, of not suppressing your the autistic aspects of your embodiment. So to mask is to essentially like be in the closet, right? You know, to perform neurotypicality, to perform to embody yourself uh, in a way that is in keeping with dominant norms, so nobody can tell you're autistic because you're holding back all the interesting autistic stimming and embodiment and such. And so unmasking is to learn to stop doing that, to learn to let yourself move autistically or let yourself move, you know, I mean, I think a lot of different forms of neurodivergence, you know, so-called ADHD and dyslexia and such, have distinctive embodiment traits that go with them. And so to let yourself explore that and live that and embody that is unmasking. It's different from neuroqueering. Unmasking can be a neuroqueering practice, but unmasking also is risky, and especially for people in positions of less social privilege. You know, if you are, you know, depending on your socioeconomic status and the color of your skin and various factors like that, you could be seriously at risk for unmasking. You know, you could be a target you know, police or ICE agents, or, you know, all there's dangers to it. And so the idea of, oh, everybody should unmask is a little like, I don't know, it's that would you know, certainly wouldn't have been safe for me in the places that I grew up, you know. I mean, that's why I learned to mask in the first place. So I think it's there's something a little like uh uh highly highly privileged about being able to blithely say, oh, everyone should unmask. Uh, Neuroqueering is about loosening the grip of normativity on oneself. And so with neuroqueering, I would say, oh, don't, it's not that everybody should unmask all the time. It's that you should be able to teach yourself to unmask in private, teach yourself to completely break down the habitual normative embodiments you've internalized in private, in whatever safe spaces you can find. And then when you are in a place where you have to mask in order to be safe or just in order to achieve your career goals or whatever it is, don't mask tightly. Like there's a difference between deeply held bodily tensions that keep you locked into a performance of normativity versus a mask that you intentionally put on and can take off as soon as you're alone again. So it's neuroqueering is about that flexibility. And that's the key, that it's not just, oh, everybody should be unmasked. It's be able to unmask. It's cultivate the flexibility so that you can use it as needed.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for that. Let's see, I just lost my thought of what I was going to say. Oh, just before we transition to the Q&A, I just wanted to emphasize something that you said there about somatics and how somatics can be so important for the integration with psychedelics and then with all kinds of experiences, because that just seems so important. And also in terms of this experience of, anyone who's attending right now, that after we are finished, perhaps some sort of somatic practice to integrate what you have taken in today. Just wanted to kind of invite everyone to that. And now I think I'm going to pass the mic to, I believe, Adina. I think Adina's going, yeah, there you are. Great, and Adina's going to lead us in the Q&A. She's going to look at the questions and then, yeah.
Yeah, there are so many wonderful questions, and thank you so much for this conversation. Here's the first one. How do we work with traumatized neuroqueers who don't believe are triggered by any body-based work? How can we help them connect with their body mind?
Really, really the same way we do with anyone else. So I wouldn't even use the term neuroqueers because it's too identity oriented. Anybody can neuroqueer. So it's not like being autistic. It's not like being part of a specific neurocognitive minority group. It's anyone can neuroqueer. So I would be disinclined to think of neuroqueers as a distinct group. Um, it's um, it's really just how do we work with traumatized human beings? And I you know, the um the neurodivergence, of the neurodivergence and the queerness of your clients might affect how you hold the space for them. It might affect it might have helped shape the particular ways in which they were traumatized or the ways the trauma landed with them. But the methods that work are the methods that work as long as the framing is good. And, there's existing systems like sensory motor psychotherapy, for instance, that have ways built in of working up to it gently. I mean, we say like you can say like triggered by any sort of embodiment practice, but uh I don't think it's true because, like I say, walk is an embodiment practice. If the person can take a little walk around the room and not go into a PTSD flashback, then you have a non-triggering embodiment practice. And you can go from take a little walk around the room to take a little walk around your room, noticing the contact between your feet and the ground and build up from there.
That might be a nice integration practice for people after this. Just
Everybody should take a little walk today.
take a little walk, feel your feet on the floor if that's accessible to you. Let's see, there are so many questions. Here we go. Can you share, can more be, excuse me, can more be shared about the Eurocentric cultural roots of somatics and the need to expand the roots to embrace broader cultural foundations in terms of how we are embodied and the weight of cultural histories.
I think that's more than I want to unpack during a fairly short Q&A session, and there are somatic practices around the world, um, across, a vast diversity of cultures and a vast diversity of historical periods. Somatic psychology, I think, in the way we talk about the field of somatics now, um, today is often has, it has European roots because so much of it is rooted in, the modern psychology, modern psychodynamic psychologies and, work of people like Wilhelm Reich and such. And so there's a particular thread that's being explored, but it's very easy to expand it, right? It's very easy to expand and say, okay, well, these principles are already at work. I mean, you look at like, there are practices, there are yogic traditions, working with the chakras and working with, Kundalini energy and such, that really do very much the same sort of thing that like Reiki and therapy does, for instance, and you know, traditions of dance and movement in all kinds of cultures worldwide and historically, some of which have been lost through colonialism, some of which have been reclaimed, rediscovered, regenerated. New things are always forming. So I don't think somatics is necessarily Eurocentric. I think that uh, you know, when you have a particular, when you have when it's constructed as an academic field and a field of practice, with uh, a lot of European roots in there, it's gonna look Eurocentric in that particular incarnation. I don't think it needs to stay that way, but I would say that any somatic practice, um, can tap one into one's own cultural and ancestral roots if one wants to go that route. If you're in this position of like, okay, well, my ancestors aren't European, my ancestors were colonized by Europeans or North Americans, um, uh, I want to get in touch with my particular uh, uh, ancestral traditions. You can start with whatever somatic practices are available to you just to open up the body, right? Just to free yourself from like normative cultural embodiments that you may have learned through a colonizer culture or something. You can liberate the body from that, open yourself up, and see what you can tune into. So, in a sense, it doesn't matter where the particular practice is from. What matters is what can you use it to attune to? What can you use it to open yourself to? And that absolutely does not have to stay connected to, Eurocentric roots or any specific roots.
Thank you for that, Nick. I wanted to just add, one way that I've thought of this too is that there's a way that in Western society, we sort of had this body-mind split that happened in sort of philosophy, and then that carried through into like psychology as the field of psychology was kind of created in Western society, that there was this concept of mind being separate from body. And then over time, we've sort of like, there's been this evolution of realizing that, well, no, that wasn't accurate. What was actually believed before that is more accurate, that we are body minds, even if people weren't using those exact terms, that is really more accurate. And so that's where there's been this movement where somatics was a little more fringe in Western psychology, and now it's becoming more mainstream. That I think is part of that evolution that's happening, that we're recognizing that somatics, like what you said, Nick, before, that somatics is such an important part of the integration of all of the other kinds of modalities of psychology and theoretical orientations of psychology. And that's also true then for things that are not part of Western psychology, that somatics, that integration piece, is so important for all of it. So just wanted to add that.
Yeah, and it's important to name, when we know the lineages that we're coming from, to name the lineages. I'm hoping we have time for 2 more questions. Let's see, because I have one I want to sneak in about stimming. So if you want to slip in something, you write beautifully in Neuroqueer Heresies about, you kind of broadly define stimming. So if you can maybe talk about that here. But here's another question. Does Dr. Walker have recommendations for those of us who are autistic practitioners and teachers to develop our ability to stay present with uncertainty and ambiguity for those we are supporting? How do we cultivate this flexibility after a lifetime of creating more structured approaches to holding the overwhelming world and maintaining our own safety?
Great question. So I will say a couple of things. First of all, as far as tolerance for ambiguity goes, and breaking that down, any somatic practice that breaks down uh, uh, fixed limited embodiments and frees you to tunes you into the spontaneous, frees you to just be open and spacious, will work. So a combination of various things. For instance, doing like classical Reichian de-armoring combined with authentic movement, that's something like that. There's like, okay, you got to do something to break down the stuck patterns, and then you have to do something to keep those patterns from reasserting themselves. You have to do something to create more spaciousness and room for spontaneity in yourself, and keep those spontaneity muscles working, keep the channel open. So there's a lot of different ways to do that, a lot of different paths. I think John Conger's book, The Body in Recovery, is a really nice one in terms of a general overview of that sort of like combination of breaking down rigidities and opening to spontaneous movement. So the other thing that I want to say about that, though, is that I'm a big fan of structure. And I think that we want to break down the limiting structures inside ourselves, within our own body mind, and be more open to spontaneity and ambiguity and spacious. In order to do that well, and especially in order to do it safely for clients, you need a strong container. And so a very carefully structured container is crucial for it. I'm not advocating a therapeutic environment where you're like, oh, there's no rules now. I'm advocating like a therapeutic container where uh, the rules and understandings of how you're doing things and the boundaries of the therapeutic container are very, very strongly structured, so that you've created a very solid container for the fluid ambiguity that you're going to be working with in that space. And this is crucial. This is something I learned from being an Aikido teacher my whole life, because people come to my Aikido dojo who are familiar with my work, and they're very surprised when it comes to Aikido. I am a classicist. I am a rigorous traditionalist when it comes to the traditional Japanese style dojo etiquette. Very clear bowing, always start on time. Everyone's, very clearly like, there's clear boundaries of etiquette and practices of etiquette and structure for everything, because that creates the safe container where we can play wildly with our bodies and play with, the dance of aggression and grace and such in the martial arts. And without without those strict rules of structure and etiquette to call us to continual mindfulness, it wouldn't be safe to do that kind of work.
Thank you. I think we're getting close to time now, so we're going to have to transition, but thank you. That was amazing. And this is a wonderful conversation. Elizabeth, are you going to come on? I think we were going to make space if either of you had any closing comments. And I just want to say, as my closing comment, if you've spoken to one neurodivergent person, you've spoken to one neurodivergent person. And please continue to listen to neurodivergent voices.
And cultivate your own neurodivergent voice.
Beautiful. Thank you so very much, all three of you. I have received multiple comments through the chat of great appreciation from people experiencing how enriching, enlivening, and inspiring your sharing has been today. So there are heart emojis and applause happening and all kinds of positive feedback coming through me and the channel in the chat to all of you. This has been one of the largest ISMETA events ever. There were over 600 people registered for the event, so the interest in this topic is enormous. And it's been such an honor to have you here as experts on neuroqueering somatics. So in the chat, we have offered multiple links for people to continue staying in touch with future events about neuroqueering somatics specifically, as well as joining the more general ISMETA newsletter and the link for the YouTube channel where this video will be posted in the next day or two.
You know what I'm going to do is I know we're coming in from all around the world, and for people in the San Francisco Bay Area, I will put in the chat my the URL for my Aikido dojo. If you want to see what I mean by intensely structured. So there's the URL in the chat there.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. So
I don't know if the audience can actually see the chat, but well.
Yes, if you hit main chat, the audience can see it.
Okay, great.
Yep, we're getting thumbs up that your
Sweet
offering has
right.
been received. Yes, aikiarts.com. It's there.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for having us here.
With a bow of gratitude to all of you, participants as well as presenters. May you metabolize, integrate, digest in whatever way works for you through movement after a rich meal here together. Thank you. And we'll see you for future events.